You are listening to Talking Star Wars.
Hello, Star Wars fans. I'm Alex,
And I'm Connor.
and today we are going to talk about Star Wars.
Yes, we cover here on this podcast many a topic ranging from what's going on in the movies, the TV shows, the books, or just general lore. And I believe today we're going to be focusing more on a general lore topic. So, Alex, what do we have in store for the lore today?
Yeah, so welcome everyone to episode 71 of Talking Star Wars, Exotic Materials in Star Wars. Specifically, we are going to talk about three substances that fill the role of the fantastic and exotic material used in weapons as the subject of quests and serving as a vital part of the fantasy side of the science fantasy universe that is Star Wars. So today we are going to look at the parallels to other materials and the in-universe uses of Kyber.
One of the primary elements in the Star Wars universe is the lightsaber. And the Kyber crystal, whether from Legends or current canon, has served as the heart, the power source for this weapon.
Yeah. So one thing to note about Kyber crystals is that they are very much an expanded universe phenomenon. If your only exposure to Star Wars is having watched the films, Kyber crystals might not even really be on your radar.
Mhm.
Because while we know that lightsabers are powerful and the weapon of the Jedi, the exact mechanism of their functioning is relatively unknown. We see three different lightsabers in the original trilogy. Sorry, four. We have Obi-Wan's, Anakin's original, Vader's, and the one Luke makes for himself, Return of the Jedi.
Mhm.
Each of which we know is powered by a different Kyber crystal. Obi-Wan's from his days as a Jedi, Anakin's from when he was a Jedi. Luke discovers one on himself to forge his lightsaber with, and Vader uses a lightsaber made by the blood crystal of a Jedi master he murdered after becoming Darth Vader. So those are the Kyber crystals we see in the original trilogy. And even in the prequel trilogy, where we see many more Jedi with many more lightsabers, we do not have an explanation or even a depiction of the mechanics behind them. It was
Mhm.
simply not an important piece of world building present in the prequel trilogy.
Yeah, I think that the greatest thing that we got was from the old visual dictionaries, where everything and anything was expanded on in the Star Wars universe. Not always uh, canon, but still interesting nonetheless. They would have a split view of what a lightsaber would look like, and you'd be able to see the power core and the focusing crystal and the other ignition crystal. Um, so there's some fantasy around it, but it's nebulous whether it still exists in canon now.
Um, so Kyber crystals are certainly canon at this point. They are
Mhm.
prominent plot point that's present in several episodes of the Clone Wars when there was a ritual followed by Jedi Padawans during the time of the Republic where they would journey to the ice caves on Ilum to retrieve their Kyber crystal and to find the specific one that followed them or that called to them. And
Mhm.
this was a deliberate training ritual as well. And the Kyber caves were intended to test certain weaknesses and strengths that the Padawans had before a Kyber crystal that is attuned to them would be revealed to them. This same ritual is done by our favorite Bakken Jedi, Cal Kestis, who must retrieve a new Kyber crystal that is his own after his master's is destroyed in the video game Fallen Order. And we have many other depictions of kyber crystals that we'll get into in a minute, but they are a very vital part of the expanded universe, and I
Mhm.
would say a compelling one.
Oh
But
yeah.
before we talk sort of more about this depictions of kyber crystals and also how they're perverted in the use of imperial superweapons,
Mhm.
where what you want to talk more about their function, Connor, and what we know about them as a material?
Sure. So back in the expanded legends, kyber crystals were just one kind of crystal that could power a lightsaber. Now, if you have a lightsaber, it is powered by a kyber crystal. So in that ceremony where Padawans go to search for a lightsaber crystal, it's something that is very emotional. It's where they have to actually attune with a crystal, and from there, the crystal will get its color. Whether you are a blue or green type of lightsaber person, or if you're Mace Windu, you'll get a purple one. Uh, and then in High Republic and other eras, you'll get different colors. But it has a certain magical resonance with the Force user who is searching for and utilizing the crystal. Uh, I saw a great piece of art where Anakin Skywalker is in his late teens with a group of younglings having to get a crystal for his third or fourth lightsaber after misplacing his previous ones. So it's a pretty powerful, significant journey for some Jedi to find the crystal that is a part of their lightsaber, much like a wand in Harry Potter.
Yeah, and it's a good parallel to Harry Potter because much like the attuned wand in Harry Potter, it is entirely possible for a person to use a lightsaber crystal they are not attuned with. Anakin is thrown lightsabers upon being freed on Geonosis. We see Luke in the recently released comics finds an interim lightsaber that is yellow in color in a High Republic archive after his previous lightsaber is taken along with his hand, before he himself passes the rite of a Jedi Knight and creates his own green-bladed lightsaber. So it is entirely possible, and then even only potentially force-sensitive Finn is able to very effectively, well, moderately effectively use a lightsaber just as a very sharp weapon in The Force Awakens when he stabs several of his former compatriots and, tries to duel Kylo Ren and almost dies. But he's still just fine. It's still a powerful weapon. But as we see primarily in the training episode between Sabine and Kanan, when she is learning to use the dark saber in Rebels, that a Kyber crystal, and particularly dark saber, has a very old style and difficult to attune with Kyber crystal. The attunement makes everything easy. Let's let what lets the force flow through someone wielding a lightsaber. There is resistance if you're not attuned to that Kyber crystal. And so while it is certainly possible for anyone to wield a lightsaber as a weapon, for the untrained or the unattuned, it is little more than a stick of light that can cut through anything. Han Solo is more than capable of cutting open a tauntaun to keep Luke warm, but we don't see him out there sparring with a lightsaber to fight off Boba Fett.
Yeah, one thing that I wanted to bring up about the dark saber in general is that do we know whether or not a Kyber crystal is powering that blade?
Yes, we are. It does have a Kyber crystal. It is
Gotcha.
done in an older style, and it is implied that the Kyber crystal is difficult to attune with. But this also shows that it's not simply like one Kyber crystal attunes to one person. Kyber crystals, well, maybe showing some forms of attunement with the Force, are not living things. So much like they are not just attuned to one person forever. And as we'll get to in a moment, they can be corrupted by the dark side.
Sure. In multiple different ways, because I think that transitioning into their corruption, Kyber crystal can be directly corrupted and be used as a Sith lightsaber. So it's more of a taking the energy that's already imbued there and causing the crystal itself a connection to the living force to bleed, which is something that I don't think we've seen in live action media. It's been more so in the books. I don't even think we've seen an animated rendition of that, unless I'm mistaken.
There is a one in Jedi Survivor. We see one of the antagonists of that game who confronts Cal take a Kyber crystal. This is Dagan Gera, a fallen High Republic Jedi who was brought out of cryostasis. And his first action upon being freed from his prison, that Cal assumed was simply a survival area, is to bleed his yellow Kyber crystal red almost immediately. So we do see this happen in a visual depiction in Jedi Survivor. We see Vader do this in the Dark Lord of the Sith comic when he murders a Jedi Master that had taken the Barash vow. He bleeds his Kyber crystal at Sidious's command to forge his red lightsaber, as he is not allowed to have a weapon until he has killed a Jedi and bled their crystal.
Sure.
We know that Inquisitors use blood crystals from Jedi who survived, but because they are not true Sith, they do not have to go through the process of murdering their own. They're more of an industrial Kyber crystal. And so those are the depictions we see of bled Kyber crystals. There are other mentions of it having happened in the past, but just a single Sith bleeding a Kyber crystal is not the only way that Kyber can be corrupted, and is also shed some light on what Kyber is in the setting as a whole.
Sure.
So, Kyber is said to be the hearts of the most ancient stars, by our favorite Force sensitive from Rogue One. Connor, do you remember?
That would be Chirrut Wade.
Yeah. And we learned through the expanded universe that Chirrut Way is correct, and that Kyber forms in the hearts of the most ancient stars and is then found embedded on certain planets after they go supernova and spread their Kyber throughout. Much how things like uranium are created in our own universe,
Sure.
though without the mystical force sensitive element. Uranium just provides gamma radiation, so do not try to build a lightsaber with uranium, please,
Oh, no.
enriched or otherwise. And so that said, we do see depictions of large pieces of Kyber, not just on the individual level, being corrupted by violence or by other events. There are four particular depictions that I can think of in canon or canon adjacent media that I want to draw attention to for corrupted Kyber.
Yeah, and it's this really helpful, just the overarching look at what the Empire has done is kind of perverted Kyber, where it's always, even in a Sith's lightsaber, has been more of a spiritual connection between the user and the crystal itself. Whereas the Empire has no stock in any kind of personal connection. They are just using Kyber as a lethal weapon.
Yeah, and that is our first example, and probably the example most of our audience will be familiar with, is that Kyber crystals and the refraction of energy thereof form a key component of the Death Star superlaser. So whether they are exactly like red glowing corrupted Kyber crystals, we don't know at this point, but it's probably likely. And we have a whole book from Galen Erso's perspective, Catalyst, about his experiments with Kyber crystals, attempting to get them to refract energy in the right way without Krennic having told him entirely what he's doing. And then when he figures it out, he tries to flee. And then we all know how that works out. Galen Erso ends up back under Krennic's thumb in a much less free capacity than he previously had been. So that is the first large scale sort of corruption we see, is the sort of the industrial corruption, where Kyber, rather than being treated as a semi-mystical and precious metal to be, or material to be used by an order of warrior monks who know its purpose, is instead mined en masse, first by the Empire, then by the First Order. The First Order mines out the Kyber mines of Ilum to power Starkiller Base. So we see, and those are our first example, are the creation of super weapons with Kyber, which does not end well for any of the super weapons, because it turns out Kyber crystal is relatively fragile, and so you put an array and a power capacitor or a thermal regulator. Apparently, using Kyber in your super weapon gives it a flawed weak point that can be targeted by proton torpedoes or X-wings. It's just the law of nature.
Mm-hmm.
So that's our first example of seeing large-scale corrupted Kyber. And just going quickly through some other examples, there is season 2 of Star Wars Visions, where we see a planet where its Kyber mines are entirely corrupted by Kyber. And there is a small, fuzzy girl whose song is able to mass purify Kyber. And so when we hear from a Jedi visiting that this was done due to some kind of great conflict or war that happened there, where it was so violent that it corrupted the natural Kyber mines of the planet. And the Kyber is now red and tinged by the dark side until the unique ability of, I believe her name is Aura, is able to purify the Kyber crystals on the planet.
And did we decide what I'm sorry, did we decide like what era this took place in? Because this story seemed like it could have been timeless. Like this could have been Old Republic, High Republic. What did we eventually land on there?
I think we decided that was fairly timeless. It could have been any time when Jedi exist. It could have even been in the far future when the Jedi Order has been reemerges.
Yeah. And that's one minor point that I'd like to make, is that Star Wars in general is just this idea of timelessness. This happened so long ago. Even in the High Republic, things are still largely the same as far as the aesthetic. So the idea of lightsabers being around and Kyber being utilized for them is a concept that has been around since the very most ancient of times. We don't have a a canon explanation for how the lightsaber was invented.
Yeah, there are legends explanations of like batteries and things, but in the current canon, it's sort of shrouded in myth.
Mhm.
Um, and then I know we want to get into more about like the meaning and other parallels to kyber crystals as a mystical material, but just a couple other examples of corrupted kyber. We have a myth told in the Dark Legends compendium that talks about a star, an ancient star, whose heart of kyber has become red. And
Mhm.
so it sends waves of solar flares that literally like turn a Shavastavan into a werewolf and have this corrupting influence on everyone on this forgotten planet. It's a
Mhm.
very horror story-esque way, but also fits neatly into the world building of like not only can a lightsaber's kyber crystal be corrupted, but the heart of an ancient star's entire core can be a corrupted piece of kyber, and it has these deleterious effects on everyone who steps foot on its surface.
Mhm.
And then the last example is just sort of a bit of fill in world building. It turns out there's a giant chunk of corrupted kyber on Exegol, which is what's used in the super weapons present in the fleet of the Final Order. Uh,
Mhm.
it's also that's sort of the industrial side, but literally, you know how Ochi of Bestoon lost his eyes when we see him in a flashback? Well, he got too close to the giant kyber crystal, got sucked against it, and had most of his skin and eyes burned off. So,
That'll happen.
uh, OG of Bestoon does not make great choices in any media he's depicted in, whether that's Shadow of the Sith, in flashback in uh, the Rise of Skywalker, or anywhere else. So
With a name like Ochi of Bestoon, I would not expect any less.
yeah, come on, Ochi, get it together.
But
All right.
I'd like to highlight the fact that, okay, so we have the Empire who has okay, one and a half, if you count the Death Star too, uh, super weapons that are powered by Kyber, to the point where by the Last Jedi they have these cannons that use Death Star technology in order to activate their weapons. So the fact that they are making these devices more mobile, smaller, reflects our current natural day life, where that's is what's happening with technology in general, from computers to anything you can imagine. So that's one thing that fans point out is, why does everything have to be Death Star related? It's like, well, when you have a weapon that's that effective, of course, that is going to be replicated and made to be tragically effective.
Yeah, and the Darth Vader comics that are sort of trying to fill in some of the plot holes present
Mhm.
in the sequel trilogy show that there is a mystical component to the power of the Final Order fleet. Like this is not anyone could go and make a fleet with super weapons that could destroy entire planets. This is deeply tied to the powerful corrupted kyber crystal that has been present for eons on the ancient Sith planet of Exegol. If you
Mhm.
don't have access to the ancient Sith planet of Exegol, steeped in the dark side for millennia, you can't make your Final Order fleet that has your super weapons using corrupted kyber. So you can't have one without the other.
Mhm.
It's a kind of clumsy world building, yes, but is it an attempt to explain why everyone just does not start using Kyber super weapons? Also, yes.
Mhm.
Yeah. So
So, anything left to say in regards to Kyber as a technology?
that was the technology, but I think let's see in what narrative role, similar to other works or in other fantasy world building, do we think Kyber is sort of taking the place of? My immediate thought is that it's kind of similar to the Rings of Power in Lord of the Rings,
Hmm.
where you have to not maybe we're more the corruptive influence of Red Kyber reminds me of the One Ring, though to a much lesser degree. It must have been used by minerals found in secret different places. Only certain people can wield the weapons created from it. So it's not a perfect parallel, but again, it's this
Mhm.
mystical material used only by a certain sect that gives the wielder specific powers. So, in what other media do you see something, or what other mythological material or ability do you see Kyber on your side, Connor?
I think immediately of the Dark Crystal, just because I'm no expert on the Dark Crystal. I was much more of a Jim Henson's Labyrinth fan than Jim Henson's Dark Crystal. But it's a Muppet film where there's this malignant crystal that I think people are feeding energy into. But it's really just more so resonant around who owns it. And the villains own it, so it is a dark crystal. Once the powers that be sway, it becomes a light crystal, it becomes purified. Very much in the same way that Ahsoka Tano purifies two red lightsabers to make them into white bladed sabers. Um, but otherwise, if we're to pull any kind of, I would say, real world illusion, it's very much akin to nuclear armaments. It's the plutonium that you were talking about. It's this idea of, well, this could be used well. Jedi use lightsabers not primarily for offense. Like, yes, they have incredible offensive capabilities, but it's more so for defense. It's for blocking blaster bolts. It's for defense in that way. You know, you can listen to our lightsaber form episodes to know that a lightsaber isn't solely used for a violent weapon. But then in the hands of the Empire, we no longer have this elegant sense of weaponry. We just have the destructive power, much like
But
nuclear weapons.
well, you're here to hear first, everyone. Kyber crystal control and the ability to use enriched plutonium for nuclear proliferation. Definitely could draw a parallel there. If you think
Yes,
it's a bit
yes.
of a stretch, let us know. But I can see Connor's point.
Mhm.
And I think the last point we want to make is it also reminds me of the substance lyrium from Dragon Age, which is a strictly fantasy setting, but where lyrium is literally, distilled magic in mineral form, able to empower those who are mages. And its corrupted form, red lyrium, has an extremely negative effect on everyone who comes near it, to the point it can grow out of people's skin, take over their minds, but it also needs to be corrupted via a deliberate blading presence. So that is another substance that reminds me of kyber crystals, to the point where it's even the red lyrium is even mined and used in nefarious purposes by the antagonists. And its control is strictly controlled by the religious institution of the time to keep control of its dangers. So lyrium and from Dragon Age, and kyber crystal from Star Wars. And I think the parallels we're seeing here definitely to show Kyber, while it can be used in an industrial context, and we might talk about it in that context, there is a mystical element of it that cannot be ignored, and it definitely leaning on the fantasy side of our setting.
Mhm. Uh, One thing that I wanted to point out, just as far as that red Illyrium goes, it's a callback to what Star Wars has done with the idea of a Sith lightsaber. Sith lightsabers in legend were synthetic crystals, not natural, not kyber. To make them something that has been impurified is much more significant in the lore of lightsabers and to a Sith's journey than just having to manufacture a red lightsaber blade.
Uh, One other thing about kyber crystals that's interesting is how recently they've sort of been used as almost talismans by a couple of characters that we see. The
Hmm.
first example is Jyn Erso, where she wears a kyber crystal gifted by her father Galen Erso, and its
Sure.
presence is detected by the aforementioned Chirrut Inway. It serves no other purpose in the story. It does not ever power a weapon. It does not become Chekhov's gun hanging on the wall where it superpowers a blaster. But it's sort of worn as just an example of like adhering to the old ways. So
Mhm.
she wears the kyber crystal from her father, and the kyber itself, less so than even a material, as I said, is like an amulet.
Mhm.
And the other character that we see using it this way is as a sign of a potential loyalty and trying to bring him into his rebellion conspiracy. Luthen in Andor gives
Mhm.
a kyber crystal from the Rakatan Empire to the Andor himself to as payment for the job, um,
Mhm.
the heist job that he hires him for.
Yeah.
And in fact, it is that the presence of that kyber crystal that then reveals the fact that he was a paid member of the conspiracy to his fellow heistees.
Mhm. So interesting. It brings to mind two allusions to other pieces of media where people are worshiping atomic weapons. One is from the well-renowned Beneath the Planet of the Apes, the original sequel to Planet of the Apes, where there is a subterranean group of humans who worship the last remaining atomic weapon. And then also in Stephen King's work of The Stand, we have a character who also venerates atomic weaponry. I think both of these cases are much more from a very negative point of view, whereas I think both characters in Star Wars, Jin and Luthen, are trying to venerate this idea of what the Kyber once was. it represents something greater.
Yeah, it's almost worn like a Christian cross would be a
Mhm.
symbol of or it's a piece of art, or a crucifix, or a Star of David. Um, so I think it definitely emphasizes sort of the structured religious aspect of the Jedi and what they represented, and how Kyber, for those in the know, was an example of what they once venerated.
Sure.
And another piece of Kyber to mention, it's non-destructive, is that on the planet of Jeddah, during the time of the High Republic, there were the Great Kyber mirrors, where a person
Mhm.
was able to once a year go to them and look into them and receive a vision of themselves, or see something, a truth about themselves that they might otherwise have missed. Pilgrims would make trips to gaze into the Great Kyber mirrors
Mhm.
to learn more about themselves. Interesting. So this has been part one of our exotic materials episode of episode 71, detailing specifically about kyber crystals. As mentioned in the episode start, join us next week for episode 72, which will dive into other rare materials in the Star Wars universe. Beskar, mostly wielded by Mandalorians, and Cortosis, the Jedi killer.
Until next time, Star Wars fans.
We'll see you sometime soon in a galaxy right here.